Bonjour Tommy Orange, vous n'êtes pas né avec la littérature, mais étiez-vous entouré d'histoire et si oui, comment ont-elles influencé l'écrivain que vous êtes devenu?
I don't know. I took so long to get to writing. I don't know how much influence my childhood had on it. I didn't start writing until after college, so I'd already gotten my degree in sound engineering. And I was a musician and I was an athlete before I started writing and before I really got involved in reading and in fiction. I'd certainly had a crazy life, and my family is a little crazy, and that definitely probably influenced me in different ways. But stories and storytelling didn't really play a big part of my early life.
C'est arrivé en travaillant dans une librairie, comment vous est venue cette révélation littéraire?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in a family of readers. Fiction was never talked about as having any value, or nobody handed me a book ever and was like, "This will change your life," or "You'll love this," or you need to read this. It just wasn't a part of my life. And so, really discovering fiction for the first time in that used bookstore was a revelation for me because I just had no real exposure to it in a way that felt that it spoke to me. There were school assignments and books that were assigned that I tried and was not interested in, and it was the lives that were written about didn't really feel that closely related to mine. And so by the time I came to it, I would say I was on some kind of spiritual journey too, because I grew up, my mom being evangelical Christian and speaking in tongues in church, and my dad in Peyote Church, which is where my parents met. So they're both very religious people. Um, and I didn't follow either one of their ways. And so I sort of went at fiction with a kind of religious fervor, looking to fill that big hole with something. And fiction, what it does with the imagination and building this whole world, um, with characters that all resemble life, and all the different things that fiction can be. It turned something on in me for the first time, and it was not long after falling in love with reading it that I decided I wanted to try writing it, having not been a writer at all before that.
Vous avez grandi à Oakland, en Californie. Comment est-ce que cela a façonné votre identité amérindienne?
Well, I don't live there now. I live in the mountains, but I lived there my whole life, and so growing up, my dad is Cheyenne, from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, is where we're enrolled, and my mom is white. And going back to Oklahoma to see our family on his side was a little bit more of how I saw like the real Indian experience was going back to Oklahoma. And Oakland, we only knew one other family, and that family's last name was Brown. So it was confusing as a young child being the Orange family and the Brown family, and it's the only two Indian families I knew of. Of course, I ended up working in the community, and for almost 10 years, worked in the Native community in Oakland, and came to get to know and understand. Got to know and understand the community very well, and to know the history, and that there were a lot of other people like me with this mixed background. A lot of people from different tribes or just with mixed race heritage. And so, growing up as a kid, I think to some extent I felt, like I was the only one. Often in the classroom, there weren't other Native kids. It was our family. I would see my sisters at school, but not really any other Native kids. But then by the time I worked in the community, after about 10 years of that, I really came to understand the depth and the long history in Oakland that Native people have. and it influenced me writing the book very much, knowing all these stories existed and they didn't exist in popular culture in any way, in films or in books. I didn't see anyone talking about Native people relating to the city, and so I think that having that absence there influenced me to want to write about it.
Dans votre roman Ici n'est plus ici, aux éditions Albin Michel, vous écrivez que nous sommes le résultat de ce qu'ils ont fait à nos ancêtres, le résultat de notre survie. En quoi cela fait-il partie de votre être et de votre encrier?
Well, I know I said earlier that storytelling or stories didn't really influence me as a young person, but there was one story that we heard more than once, and it was about the Sand Creek Massacre, and it's something that my dad heard growing up, and it was a really devastating event for our tribe specifically, and it kept being told, and because it was so devastating. And I think hearing that at home and the way my dad would talk about history and the U.S. government and Native people versus what I was hearing at school, which was about the Pilgrims and the Natives getting along, really created um, a conflict in me, knowing that what the institution and the official position of the country through its institutions had to say about history was very different than the way Native people experienced it. And I think in the book, I was really trying to um, have the reader understand how history impacts people in the present. And some people benefit from it, and other people, it's a big burden. There's this term called historical trauma that I came into contact with through nonprofit work when I was working in the Oakland Native community, and it was in a lot of grants. We got a lot of grant money, and historical trauma is like a big piece of language that's used to talk about the way um, Native people experience history and its effects on our communities. There's a lot of institutional things that were done along the way, including genocide and boarding schools and uh, a lot of ways that we've been devastated that play out into the present, and the way that history is presented to a lot of people, at least in my generation. It's changing now. Is like you might be interested in it as a hobby, and not like as if it doesn't affect people now, as if studying it um, uh, could not be ways to understand the present. It's sort of taught it. History is taught as if like this special interest thing, and the more you come to understand these conflicting narratives about what this country is, what America is, and what its foundations are, the more it starts to look pretty sinister the way that history is taught.
James Baldwin a dit que les gens sont pris au piège dans l'histoire et l'histoire est prise au piège en eux. Pourquoi l'histoire n'est-elle jamais terminée et comment détruit-elle les personnages de votre roman?
Well, I think so. A lot of the characters struggle with addiction and poverty, and these are all just things that are in Native communities. Things that I saw in the community, things that I experienced in my family. Um, and I think it's sort of exhaustive to go through all of the different ways. It would be exhausting to have to hear the different ways that, um, things like boarding schools and Indian termination policy and assimilation, what this does to the soul of a people, the psyche of a people, and what it does to their children and their grandchildren, how that plays out over time is really something that you know I tried to have play out over the course of the book. So it's not something that I can easily come up with a this is why they're the way they are, because it takes a lot to understand the way history affects people. So that's why I wrote the whole book, to sort of explore that through a lot of different characters and the way they experience um, being a Native person living now in contemporary times.
Vous auriez pu décrire une réserve, mais vous décrivez cette histoire à travers les urbains amérindiens. Pourquoi c'est important de leur donner une voix à travers votre plume et votre littérature? Et que souhaitez-vous transmettre de cette identité aux générations futures?
I really just wanted to portray Native people as contemporary people because we're only thought of and depicted in historical contexts. Um, so, the a realistic image of us now, and this based on experience that I have as a Native person, but also working in the community, just trying to portray, what our communities can look like in a novel, and doing it in a very contemporary way as a way to resist a lot of these depictions of us as only existing historically, or like the only authentic versions of us are the ones that we were, as if we don't have the ability to adapt and be modern living humans. um, so I don't know that with a novel, I'm not setting out to transmit anything to the next generations. I you know I I think novels function as a way to talk about the times that they exist within, and I'm happy that a lot of people read my book who live right now. And I don't have any messages for the um, future Native youth. I mean, I wish everyone the best, but I don't have any specific messages.